Hi all, welcome to the session on VPC deployment and PrivateLink integration. Once again, myself, this is Ashok Dasanini. I'm Senior Solution Architect with QuickSight. Now, let's get started into the agenda. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look into the agenda for the call today. We'll be doing a quick intro on what is this Amazon QuickSet feature with a VPC endpoint, and we'll take a look at how the data flow works, and we'll do a demo of setting up an end-to-end VPC through EC2 as an virtual desktop from a different IP or the VPC configured, and how the QuickSet interaction works when you access from the um, when the configured endpoint and something out of the scope. First, let's take a look at what is Amazon QuickSight with the VPC endpoint. And in this session, we will explore how the AWS Private Link interface VPC endpoints provide private connectivity between a QuickSight website, VPCs, or to on-premise networks, ensuring that traffic does not expose to the public internet. And by keeping all the communications within the Amazon network, and that can maintain the privacy and security of your QuickSight data. Additionally, the administrators can leverage this VPC endpoint policies to restrict access to the unauthorized QuickSight accounts. So, which means like if you have a multi-account model and if you want only the specific accounts to be accessed, you can configure through that specific policies, which we'll be looking in at the demo today. And finally, we will be demonstrating how to establish this end-to-end private connectivity from on-premise users to a QuickSight website using the VPC endpoint. Now let's take a look at the data flow. Here is a sample architecture of data flow. So let's start from the top to bottom, like how an end user connectivity from the laptop all the way goes to the QuickSight and responds back. First, the user goes into the quicksite.aws.amazon.com, and the company's DNS server sends a lookup request to Amazon Route 53 inbound resolver to pointing to the actual public facing endpoint. And this DNS request and its response travel securely through Direct Connect, and the user browser starts a secure HTTP connection at this point, and with a QuickSight, and the company router sends traffic through Direct Connect, which you can see between the corporate AWS account and the corporate Office network. Okay, and the traffic arrives at the QuickSight website VPC endpoint, and the VPC in which you can see here in the private hosted zone, and the VPC endpoint passes the traffic through AWS managed QuickSight servers, and finally the browser renders the QuickSight website. And some part of the requests like JavaScript, CSS, and other static assets stored in Amazon CloudFront that will be through the public internet, but remaining part of all the data that is exchanged from your AWS account on AWS website to the end user will be all through private channel through VPC endpoint. Okay. With that, let's get into the demo. For this demo purpose, I have pre-registered a user in this test QuickSight account where you can see the QS VPC user, and I'm currently logged in as workshop participant role, which is a temporary administrator for this account. Let's go ahead and get register an EC2 instance and set up the remote desktop for testing the VPC endpoint. From the AWS console, search for EC2 and let's launch a new instance for the demo purpose. Either you can launch instance from here or go to the instances and launch a new one. Let's just click on this and launch instance. I'm going to name this or the tag as QLS demo VPCE demo, and I'm going to choose Windows instance type with T2 large. Just for the performance purpose, I'm taking T2 large here, and I'm going to create a new key pair for connecting to remote desktop, and I'm going to call this as QLS key pair demo, and I'm going to create a new key. I'm going to save this into my local, and I'm going to keep all other network settings as is, like to create a new security group and allow RDS traffic, RDP traffic from anywhere with all zeros. With all this configuration, I'm going to launch an instance here. Okay. While the instance is getting created, let's move on to the next step of setting up a VPC endpoint for this. Now, from the console, I'm going to search for VPC and open it up in the new tab. From the VPC console, I'm going to go to the endpoint on the left panel, and I'm going to create a new endpoint. This is a name tag which is optional, but let's use this as QLS endpoint demo tag. And I'm going to keep it as AWS services because we're going to have QuickSight as a service for this endpoint. And for the service, I'm going to search using com.amazonaws.useast1.quicksite. Here you can see, based on my search, it already returned the service name. I'm going to select this. And for the VPC, I'm going to use the default endpoint, so the default VPC. And for the subnet, for this demo purpose, I'm just going to use only the subnet that is where the EC2 instance is being launched. So let me go back to the EC2 instance that is just created. And here you can see it is being launched in US East 1E zone. So I'm going to use the same. And this is going to be tied to the default subnet. And for the security group, again, I'm going to just use the default security group. Okay. And this is an important step where we need to update the custom policy for this VPC endpoint for this specific account to be accessed. So let's enter that policy here. I'm just going to copy paste from my local. And for the account number, I'm going to copy this event account. Okay. So this is my policy. So we are allowing all the resources with the principal star for, from this particular account. So this is very important. So this will make sure any unauthorized account access is blocked and the requests are coming only for this account through this VPC endpoint. Okay. With this setup, let's create the endpoint. Okay. While the endpoint is being created, let's go ahead and test our EC2 instance. So first I'm going to connect to this instance. I'm going to open this, connect to the instance through RDP client, and I'm going to download the remote desktop file, which is QLS VPCE demo RDP. And for the password, I'm going to use the temporary password file that I have downloaded, the key file, and this is my key, decrypt. Okay. So now I have my password. I'm going to copy and store it to my local. Okay. Let me go ahead and connect this. I'm going to enter the password. Here is my remote desktop connection. So this, we haven't enforced any VPC endpoint restrictions at this time. So I'm just going to connect to my QuickSight account and make sure the VPC test user which I've created in my local is working good for access. And let me copy paste the password. So at this point, you can see the QuickSight account can be accessible both from local and in the virtual desktop. You can see both the users from local and on the remote desktop, which is perfectly working good. Now let's go ahead and move forward with the next steps where and we are able to connect to our QuickSight account from EC2 instance, and this is going through the public internet at this point, and the data transfer is happening through the public internet, and there is some information still going through public internet. It is not all traffic. There are certain static contents like script files. All this are still happening through public. So now the actual data, what is used to render the dashboard, is what will be gone through the VPC endpoint. Now let's go to the VPC endpoint from the local console, and let's check the private DNS name here. Here you can see it is connecting to QuickSight website US East 1, which had a different DNS than what we used to connect for the QuickSight from the remote desktop. So now we have to create a hosted zone and create a record to map that public URL to use the VPC endpoint. And for that, I'm going to go to the Route 53 service, and I'm going to create a record for this. From Route 53, choose from the left plan, click hosted zone. I'm going to create a new hosted zone for this. And for the domain name, I'm going to use quicksite.awsamazon.com, which is currently we are using for the public access. And I'm going to keep it as a private hosted zone. And the region we are working on is US East 1. And the VPC is going to be default VPC. Okay, I'm going to create hosted zone. So we have our hosted zone created, and I need to add a record for this. And for that, I'm going to create a record, and I'm going to give my subdomain as useast1.quicksite.aws.amazon.com. You can see it the record type is A, which is routes traffic to an IP4 address and some AWS resource. And along with that, I'm going to create an alias to VPC endpoint, and the region again, it's going to be US East 1, and endpoint is going to be this. You can see two endpoints. I'm going to pick one without the specific region endpoint, which is a website, QuickSight website US East 1, and I'm going to create a record for this. So now we have all the three records available. Now let's go ahead and test it again from the remote desktop. So let me go ahead and refresh it. You can see it is taking some time to load. That's because the connection is being refused. Okay, you can see this the can't reach the page. The reason is when we created the endpoint, the security group we associated was the default one, where this EC2 has its own security group, which is not able to get through the network. So let's go ahead and fix that. This is just to demonstrate where are the possible chances of the configuration may fail and how to fix them. Let me go back to the console to EC2 instance. And here I'm going to search the security group. And we have associated the default. Let me take that. And I'm going to add an inbound rule for this. So I'm going to add a rule with all traffic And I'm going to use this launch wizard one, which is associated to our EC2, and save the rule. So now we have allow traffic being mapped to the security group. Let's go ahead back to the remote desktop and test. Here you can see be able to access the page now. Okay, till this point, we have configured the remote desktop, VPC endpoints, creating a hosted zone and all that, but we haven't enabled the actual VPC endpoint restriction on our account. Now let's go ahead and enable that. So for that, I'm going back to the local QuickSight console page where I'm have a admin access. On to access to that security and permission, go to Manage QuickSight, Security and Permissions. Scroll down to the page. You have this IP and VPC endpoint restriction. Click Manage. Okay. So here is the place where you have option to enforce restriction. So first, it shows which IP we are currently accessing this QuickSight account from. So when you are testing, make sure to add this IP address so this will not lock you out of your account. So one option is doing from here, or if anything gets logged, you can use the command line interface as well to remove the restrictions, which we'll be testing shortly. So what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to add this IP and call it as my IP. And for the CIDR block, I'm going to put 32, add. And for the VPC endpoint, this is the VPC endpoint we created. I'm going to copy this VPC endpoint ID. And important thing to remember is either you can, if you have multiple VPC endpoints configured under the same VPC, you can do it at the VPC level, or you can do the VPC endpoint ID as well. Add it and save the changes. So now we have just added the rules, but we haven't enforced the restriction. Let's go ahead and enforce the restriction. I'm going to turn it on. So now we should not again see any difference between the remote desktop and the local, because we are just allowing both the local IP to access the QuickSight account, and at the same time, the request that is coming through VPC endpoint from the remote desktop is also being accessible. So now I'm going to try deleting my local IP. You can see usually when you try to delete your local, which it will try to prevent the action because of accidentally locking out the account. So to remove this, I'm going to use the command line at this point. Describe my account. You can see currently I have two rules, one with the IP restriction rule and one with a VPC endpoint rule, and enable true. Now we are going to remove the IP restriction to test how this is going to block accessing from the local and allow only through VPC endpoint from the remote desktop. And for that, I'm going to enter another CLI command where AWS QuickSight update IP restriction, account ID, and the region is used one. And for the IP restriction, I'm not passing any list of IPs here, which is going to keep it blank. Let me fix this. Okay, so you can see the changes are updated. Let me try describing this again. And this time we should see only the VPC endpoint restriction. Since the changes may take 5 to 10 minutes to apply, we can still go and test on our local as well. Okay, already the changes been already got applied, which is good, where you can see the access is denied. The request is denied by the network restriction. And let's go ahead and test it from our remote desktop. Here, I'm still able to access my QuickSight account from the remote desktop. So this is how we can set up the VPC endpoint, and all the transactions are secured and the passed only through VPC endpoint in a private channel. Okay, let me show you how to disable this and get this account back using the command line again. Let me execute another command. I'm going to paste this. Here, my command is AWS QuickSight update IP restriction and the account ID, the region is this one, no enabled. Let me enter this. And now let me try describing the IP restrictions again, where you can see there is an VPC endpoint ID mapped, but the rule enforcement is false, which is disabled. Let's try refreshing our local. After disabling the VPC restriction, now we're able to access our QuickSight account back from the local. And that's the end of our demo to set up VPC endpoint for QuickSight. Thank you.